Step into the Moscow metro during rush hour and it feels like you've wandered into a fashion show. Women in heels, perfectly styled hair, flawless makeup. Ask them why they invest so much time and money into their appearance, and they'll smile and say, I do it for myself. But that's only half the truth. My name is Elvira Bary. I'm a writer born in the Soviet Union, and I can tell you this. In Russia, beauty isn't just admired, it's expected, it's demanded. Men choose, women hope to be chosen. The problem is there aren't enough men, and among those who are left, many are emotionally broken. Not by nature, but by history. A century of war, revolution, poverty, and prison camps forged a version of masculinity so repressed, so fragile, it struggles to function in relationships. These men aren't heartless, but they were raised in a culture that taught them to suppress emotion, assert dominance, and run from responsibility. This imbalance between polished, perfect women and emotionally wounded men is at the heart of one of Russia's quietest, most painful crises. I know this not just as a writer, but as a woman who lived it. This was me at 25. When I walked down the street, heads turned, I looked like I had everything going for me, but I had no one to marry, and I blamed myself. I thought I had failed at life's one essential task. That fear of ending up alone even after doing everything right was part of what drove me to leave Russia. I didn't even speak English when I came to America, but staying behind, unmarried, in a country where a woman's worth fades with every passing year, that was far more terrifying. So today we are going deeper, not into lipstick and heels, but into history, war, propaganda, gender, and survival. Because behind every perfectly dressed woman on that subway platform, there is a story. And behind every broken man, there's a reason. In traditional Russian peasant families, the man's value was far greater than the woman's. In the harsh conditions of subsistence farming, a woman simply could not feed herself and her children alone. Russian agriculture relied on tools like the sahar, a primitive plow that required enormous physical strength to use. A horse pulled it, but the farmer had to press down with full force to carve a furrow into the tough earth. Most women could not handle it, especially not while pregnant. Then there was the matter of firewood. Central Russia's brutal winters made heating essential, but heating a home required real labor. Men had to cut down trees, saw them, and split the logs with an axe. In the south, people could get by burning twigs or sun-dried manure. In the north, only firewood would do. Male labor was scarce and precious. Female labor, by contrast, was abundant. That's why the loss of a husband was considered a catastrophe, while the death of a wife was seen as tragic, but not devastating. And it happened often, particularly at childbirth. As a result, strong, relatively prosperous men frequently remarried. For a widow, especially one with younger children, remarrying was much harder. Marriage in the Russian village was not about love, it was about survival. Men sought women who were strong, hardworking, and skilled in domestic and agricultural tasks. A good husband was not measured by romance, but by his ability to keep food on the table. Sounds harsh? Wait until you see what happened when these same men chased factory wages in the big cities. By the late 19th century, Russia's population had been growing rapidly. There were more mouths to feed, but not enough land to work. Young men did what they could. They migrated to cities, taking whatever jobs they could find as janitors, waiters, cab drivers, stockers, or factory workers. But life in the city was expensive, and few men could afford to bring their families. Most lived in cramped rented rooms with 3 or 4 men sharing a space. In some cases, two men shared the same bed, one sleeping during the day, the other at night. Wives stayed behind in the villages, entirely dependent on their men's goodwill. If the husband sent money, the family ate. If not, they went hungry. Nevertheless, men working in the cities were seen as ideal marriage prospects. After all, they brought home gifts and had at least some money in their pockets. Of course, the middle class and aristocracy had more Europeanized views on marriage and gender roles. But after the Bolshevik Revolution, those elites were either exiled, destroyed, or absorbed into the vast peasant class that flooded into the cities. And with that influx, rural attitudes toward women and family life came with them, shaping the emotional DNA of modern Russia. The World War I, the Russian Civil War, and waves of deadly epidemics devastated Russia's male population. There were plenty of women and children, but few healthy, capable men left to support families. The Bolsheviks didn't make things easier. Their constant economic experiments created a permanent crisis. Before the revolution, Russia was known as the breadbasket of Europe. But by the late 1920s, the government had to introduce food rationing, and many basic goods vanished from store shelves entirely. This made it nearly impossible for many men, regardless of how hard they worked, to meet even basic expectations as providers. Even officers of the AGPU, the secret police, often lived in misery. If you want to know what that life looked like, I describe it in detail in my novel The Prince of the Soviets. The link is in the description. The traditional family began to erode. Before the revolution, divorce was rare, but the Bolsheviks legalized and radically simplified the process. At one point, people could get divorced simply by mailing a postcard. These postcard divorces created a massive problem. Men could leave their families and refuse to support their children. Women were left to shoulder both breadwinning and childcare alone. Then came the mass repressions. Men were arrested on trumped-up charges and shipped off to the Gulag. It was not just about rooting out dissent. It was a system of legalized slavery. The Soviet state literally profited off of forced labor to fund its geopolitical ambitions. I explain this in a separate video. Millions passed through the Gulag, and naturally it was mostly men who were targeted, because they were more useful on Stalin's construction sites. The standard sentence was 10 years. That meant entire generations of fathers were torn away from their families for a decade or more. Children grew up without parents. Wives were left alone with no support. But the biggest demographic blow came during World War II. We still don't know the full number of Soviet casualties. What we do know is that there is not a single Russian family without wartime losses. I researched my own family tree and was stunned to discover that every one of my grandparents lost siblings or parents during the war. This had lasting consequences. The brave, capable, high-potential men were the most likely to die. They did not pass on their genes or their values. They were simply gone. The ones who survived were those who kept a low profile and knew how to stay out of trouble. So, after the smoke cleared, who was left to marry? The answer rewired Russian family life. After the war, women faced fierce competition for men. Being unmarried was seen as a personal failure, a symbol that you were unwanted. Even a bad marriage to an abusive or alcoholic husband still offered some social legitimacy. As a result, women often tolerated deeply dysfunctional relationships. The gender imbalance was especially severe for women born in the early 1920s. The boys they had grown up with had been wiped out by the war. Many women had no one left to marry. Some wed disabled veterans, others married much older men. Love was often not part of the equation. Marriage was about the chance to have children. That's exactly what happened to my grandmother. She was deeply in love with her first husband, but he went missing in the early days of the war. She searched for him but eventually remarried, this time to my grandfather, a man with a promising career and all his limbs. Decades later, she heard her first husband's voice on a radio broadcast. He'd survived and was given an interview, searching for his former comrades, but she chose not to contact him. A whole life had passed. In some villages, only 1 or 2 men returned from the war. Women slept with them just to have children, creating entire generations fathered by a single survivor. In cities, it was common for men to go through serial marriages, living with one woman, then moving to another and another. High-ranking men, especially those with access to scarce resources, often maintained multiple families at once. I remember a secretary I once knew who had a child with her boss. She understood he would never leave his wife, but she was fine with that. He supported her and their child financially. At the time, this kind of arrangement was surprisingly common and socially accepted. Many Russian women learned early on how to rely on themselves, either because there were no men around, or because the men who were present offered little help. Women began entering the workforce as early as the 1920s, long before it became common in the West. Not out of liberation, but necessity. There simply weren't enough men to do the work. In many families, women worked full-time jobs, raised the children, and handled every household chore. Meanwhile, many men contributed little beyond their presence, and still expected to be served and respected. That dynamic didn't end with the Soviet Union. I've seen it even here among Russian immigrants in the US. Of course, not all families were like this, but it was and remains a common pattern. After World War II, the United States saw a baby boom. The Soviet Union did not. Half the country was in ruins. There was a shortage of housing and food. While my great-grandmother's generation had 6 or even 8 kids, my grandmother's generation rarely had more than 2. Children born in the 1950s and 60s often grew up without strong male role models. Men were either absent or emotionally distant, sometimes outright hostile. Few truly knew how to be a good father. There was a popular Soviet joke: a same-sex family does not mean gay. It means a household with just mom and grandma. And that was reality for many. Girls raised in these families had no clear image of what a relationship with a man should look like. They rarely had any men around, and that absence felt normal. Boys from these households had a different issue. They didn't know what it meant to be a man. From birth, they were surrounded by women: mothers, grandmothers, preschool teachers, school teachers, nurses, librarians. In many cases, the first time they encountered a male-dominated environment was when they were drafted into the army. Women who never found a man to love often poured all their affection into their sons. These boys grew up being told they were precious just for existing. They did not need to do anything to be loved. And yet, every man still wants to feel masculine. That's a deep biological instinct. This led to a painful internal conflict. On one hand, submitting to the woman who raised them felt emasculating. On the other, rebelling against those same women meant losing the only emotional support they'd ever known. So many chose submission. In many households, women became the dominant figures, and the men quietly accepted. A dynamic that would have shocked their peasant ancestors became common. This imbalance helped fuel the rise of mass alcoholism. Drinking was not new to Russia. Even in Tsarist time, villagers drank, usually during holidays. But in the Soviet Union, alcohol became something else entirely: a coping mechanism, a form of protest, a substitute for therapy. Men drank not to celebrate, but to numb themselves. The world of drinking became a male-only refuge, where women were not allowed. I have an entire video about how and why Soviet men turned to alcohol. Check it out. All of this shaped Russia's ideas of the ideal man and woman into something deeply specific and often dysfunctional. A woman, according to this worldview, must perform three major roles. The mother manager. She makes sure the house runs smoothly. She ensures the man eats well, sees a doctor, and wears clean clothes. He does not have to think about any of that. She is both wife and mother, keeping him healthy and functional. The trophy. She proves to the man and the world that he is successful and desirable. But the woman must be accomplished, beautiful, and competent, but never outshine the man. Her role is to support from the sidelines, never to take center stage. If she earns more, knows more, or shines brighter, it threatens the balance. Some men also want a much younger woman, not just for beauty or fertility, but because being desired by someone decades younger soothes their fear of aging. If a pretty, youthful girl finds you attractive, maybe you are not old after all. The muse. This is especially common in late Soviet and post-Soviet men. He doesn't really want anything from life, unless it's for her. He has dreams, maybe even talent, but doesn't pursue them until the right woman comes along. She is supposed to recognize his potential, inspire him to act, and give him purpose. Until then, he waits. No woman, no future. Meanwhile, women expect the man to love them deeply and show it through gifts, affection, and time. To act as a substitute for their father, because many women grew up with fathers who were either absent or emotionally unavailable. Be the full package. An alpha male, a tender lover, a successful professional, a handyman, a responsible domestic partner, and a caring father for their children. Is that possible? Yes, but usually not all in one person. And here lies the problem. Both men and women are chasing unrealistic ideals. The images they follow come from movies and novels, not real life. Unmet needs fester like a splinter. They hurt. And when something hurts, people look for relief. For men, the pursuit of masculinity often takes familiar forms. Martial arts fantasies. In my youth, nearly every Russian boy was obsessed with kung fu movies. They'd practice with mob handles pretending to be Bruce Lee. Combat brotherhoods online. These days, many of those brotherhoods exist on gaming platforms. Virtual battles provide a sense of camaraderie and purpose. Criminal romanticism. Stories about the criminal underworld remain hugely popular in Russia. Films, songs, prison folklore. In the Soviet Union, criminals were paradoxically seen as the freest people of all. They didn't obey laws and weren't afraid to fight back. I'm planning a whole video on the Soviet criminal world. Subscribe if you want to hear that one. Easy money. Many young men chase shortcuts to wealth. That's why crypto schemes, forex trading, and influencer marketing courses are so widespread. When you are struck in a dead-end town and watching some guy cruise around Dubai in a Lambo, it's easy to think, why not me? Maybe I just need to borrow a few thousands from mom and buy that course. The war in Ukraine. For some, the war has become a grotesque opportunity. Men enlist as volunteers or take jobs at military factories where the pay is far better than in civilian life. Women, on the other hand, find different strategies. Falling in love with their fantasy alpha. Some project their hopes onto a strongman leader, idolizing him as the embodiment of power, protection, and masculine certainty. That's how cults of dictators are born. Again, I have a video on this topic. Check it out. Escaping into fantasy worlds. Russia has entire online marketplaces built around cheap, low-quality romantic fiction. These books focus on erotica or outright pornographic plots. Love affairs with bandits, angels, demons, ghosts, and even lizard like aliens from space. If reality disappoints, fantasy delivers. Marrying abroad. I know American women complain just like Russian women. All the good men are taken. But from my perspective, maybe because of the men I knew in Russia, I see plenty of wonderful, high quality men here in the US. Many Russian women have solved their problems the same way I did. They found husbands outside of Russia. Looking back, I've realized something important. The core problem for many Russian men and women is that they are searching for a ready made partner, a man who is already successful, a woman who is already ideal. But real relationships don't work like that. Marriage is about co creating, mutually growing into who you can become. If both people are committed to nurturing each other's potential, they will thrive. The key is this: you don't help your partner become who you want them to be. You help them become who they want to be. That's the only way out of the crisis, together. If this gave you a new way to think about gender, history, or even your own relationships, please consider sharing, liking, and subscribing. And if you want to help me make more videos like this, join my think tank or buy me a coffee through the links below. And most of all, thank you for watching. Really, it means more than you know.